bad going on. A lot of you also said the Pepto-Bismol, and that is true. It has its pink color for a reason. So that Pepto-Bismol and pumpkin spice, while it might taste pretty good for some of you, is not good. Interestingly, you can get Atlantic salmon that is straight from the grocery store. So that's a real picture that I put there. And I heard a couple of folks say Spam. And if you're interested, last year, this can of Spam was on eBay for $100. Yeah, Walmart picked that up and said, well, heck, I'll just create it and they'll sell. You can get it online through Walmart. It is used primarily in Hawaii. I think I've heard about a rice dish that folks use it for. So if you're interested. The one that is not real, of course, is this bologna, because bologna by itself is gross anyways. And then if you add some pumpkin spice, it's even grosser. So, but yeah, a lot of interesting things going on. The mac and cheese was a big seller last year from Kraft, so you can still access mac and cheese. And then some other things. If you'd like your spouse with a beard or your pet to smell like pumpkin spice, there are a lot of options for you to do that. So if you do find any interesting ones, please send them to me. I collect them so I can share how not to enjoy Halloween. So, well, thank you all for attending today's session. I know a lot of you were here earlier and I chatted with a couple of you. I'm excited to be here. I actually submitted this presentation, I want to say like 2.5 years ago, which a lot of you probably registered, and then COVID hit and things really sort of changed over time. And so it's really nice to be here in person. As I mentioned, we do have some folks on the live stream. So anytime you ask a question, I'll either repeat it for the live stream or I'll hand you the mic. So if you don't want the mic, just look down at your desk, right? And I'll walk past you and then listen to what you're saying. Just a little bit about the center and myself is we were actually charged in 2019 to really understand how do we sort of ensure that every student with a disability is on the path to progress. It was an overwhelming ask. And in fact, we were asked to be focusing on kids K through transition, all disability categories in every school type. We're the first national center that goes beyond just traditional public schools. We work with private schools, charter, and are also providing guidance and resources for those students who are receiving homeschool. Now, this was prior to COVID, but under COVID, it really sort of made it clear about where students with disabilities were receiving their services and how do we make sure those services are appropriate. So the Progress Center was actually conceptualized soon after the decision was made, but things moved really slow, obviously in the federal government, and the RFP didn't really make it out until 2019. And what's interesting is when the RFP was they were first thinking about it, they were looking at calling it an IEP center. And they stepped back and they said, when I say they, the US Department of Ed, this idea of just having better IEPs, it's not really what we're trying to get to, right? We assume that if we do a good IEP, it will ultimately lead to better services, but that's not what we were finding, because we found increased compliance or procedural requirements for the IEP, but not necessarily better outcomes. So we just step back and say, you know what, we need something bigger than that. And so what the center is really focused on is developing an ecosystem or identifying the components of an ecosystem in which students with disabilities can be successful. The IEP is one part of that. And the Andrew F. decision really sort of helped us think about how to better think about the IEP and implement it, but some of these other components I'm going to share today. So our center, and I had this super fancy handout I was going to give you, but had these boxes. We sort of have 3 scopes of work. So if you're looking for support in a certain area, you are available, or we are available to support you. Our first box is really around knowledge development. And, you know, not that we're trying to interpret Andrew F. That really was from the Q&A that I included on the handouts for you. It was really to say, what does it look like when it gets to the school level, and how do we better support educators? We are charged with doing a beating the odds, meaning we're looking at national data to identify which schools are implementing services that are leading to better outcomes for students with disabilities than would be expected in that particular context. So for example, we look at all the schools in Florida, for example, and I identify those who have students with disabilities outperforming the sort of average that's performing in that context. We also have done policy scans, particularly around NDRU F. I did highlight that in the handout upload as well, but identifying which states are providing guidance around those. We found only about 50% even mention it, and very few actually provide any guidance. We are working with a small group of SEAs and our state education agencies and local education agencies to really understand what's necessary for the guidance. So it's not that SEAs are coming up with it and sharing it, it's LEAs telling the SEAs, this is what we need in order to be able to effectively implement services. Our second bucket here is evolved. So for most national centers, we do have an intensive TA component. We were asked not to do that sort of model and instead do a partnership model. And that's because when the center was funded, we didn't really know what it would look like. So we work with about 16 sites across the country and even in the Pacific Islands to really understand what's necessary for us to get success at the local level and to meet that substantive requirement that was clarified by NDRU. And then finally, what we're primarily for and why I'm here today is to share a lot of the resources that have been developed. We are moving into our 4th year on Tuesday of next week. Halloween is our culminating event for our year, but we will then be moving into our 4th year and sort of disseminating more widely a lot of the resources that were created. So for those of you on live stream, or if you're sitting in here and you can't read this print, which I can barely read, and I'm standing right here, this promotingprogress.org is our website, and everything on that website is freely available to you. We have developed a lot of those in partnership with parent centers, with local educators, with other centers around the country that are supporting SEAs, so that we're promoting a common message around how do we support students. So this is probably why you all are here, and it's why we exist as well. So when the NDRU F decision came out and we had a unanimous decision, it really was seen as this sort of pivotal moment. We haven't had a Supreme Court decision in a long time, and it really sort of got folks talking. Now, what often happens following a decision is we expect huge changes, and surprisingly, we didn't really see those. And one of the reasons is you traveled around the country, most people were unaware that that decision even existed. And this was not only at the local level, but also at the state level. The other thing is that there was this assumption it would have an immediate impact on court decisions. And if you're following a lot of the literature that's out there, it was kind of a delayed effect. I mean, a really big delayed effect. And that sort of loses its sort of urgency or impact. And that's why the center was like, look, you need to come back in. We need to really highlight this need for more substantive requirements, or this clarifying that substantive requirement. So we're not just creating procedurally appropriate IEPs, we're actually designing something that's reasonably calculated. And the wording of this is really critical. And I'm going to sort of break it down for you a little bit with some resources, but it's reasonably calculated to enable the child to progress appropriately based on the child's circumstances. Now, it wasn't really pivotal in some regions or our circuit courts, but in others, it sort of set what was considered this bare minimum of what we would provide. Now, that's not what we're looking for, right? We really want to be able to accelerate learning. And I think COVID really made it clear for us that this bare minimum is not going to work, right? But at least we have some consistency in the way that we talk about it. I will say this reasonably calculated actually is probably the most challenging for folks, because what they were finding is they didn't know, right? They hoped it would happen, but educators had a really hard time articulating why they proposed the services the way they did it. And this is for us this idea that the present levels of performance were not really clear. And I've spoken to a couple of you about this. Even when we're trying to determine compensatory ed, it's really hard to know what should have been, because we don't really have a good understanding of that particular student's needs. There's also something that's hidden in this. And if you read the commentary, although it doesn't have any legal weight, it sort of helps us understand why we need to be making some of the changes that I'll propose today. So what's probably not surprising to you is students with disabilities continue to underperform. Even when you look at the new NAEP data that just came out, it's pretty stark, particularly in certain regions of our country. Now, if you really think about it, IDEA was not meant to justify lower expectations or lower performance. But if you start to talk to folks, you start to realize, and I spoke with a very well-known researcher yesterday and kind of said something that caught me off guard. And they said, well, of course, they're not going to meet grade level standards in an IEP. Why would we have a grade level expectation in an IEP goal? And so I thought about it and I said, well, the assumption is, right, that if we provide specially designed instruction, the proposed aids and services that the kid is entitled to, our intent is to make sure they get similar benefit from that particular general education curriculum that's being provided. And I think this conversation is not alone. Over the last 3 years, we've seen this, where this persistent justification of lower expectations, when the intent of IDEA and knowing our students with disabilities is to ensure they can be involved in and benefit from the general education curriculum as appropriate. And I think that's where NJUAF really is sort of clarifying that, you know, their child circumstances may change the way they do it in many cases, or what they need in order to achieve that. But we're looking for similar expectations. I actually have two kids with disabilities. One is in the 9th grade and one is actually sitting out in the hall because I failed to take care of daycare. Now it's my mommy failed today. But I think, you know, when people say to me, oh, it's okay, he has a learning disability, that's why he can't do it, that's not sufficient for me. As a parent, I want to make sure that my child has the same post-school opportunities as their peers without disabilities. My oldest has very severe mental health and behavioral disabilities due to previous childhood experiences prior to coming with me. And those are things that are often predictive of very poor post-school outcomes, kind of similar to what we saw in the NJUAF case. But I know I know what he can do as a parent, and I want to make sure that the school has equally high expectations for my child so that he has similar opportunities to be the best that he can be, given the circumstances that he's come into the world with. Now, we're not naive, and I think one of the things with the center, you know, we often focus a lot of our professional learning for students or for teachers of students with disabilities. And I think what we've discovered, and probably you're very familiar with this, is they're not the main ones that make the difference, right? We know that there's no single teacher who has all the knowledge, the skills, the resources to support all the students on their caseload. If we expect special education teachers to be the sole driver of progress for students with disabilities, we are guaranteed not to be able to help those students. Because remember, special education is helping kids benefit something bigger, or, you know, or access and benefit from something bigger. And so they have a really critical role in partnering with others in that school to provide those specially designed instruction so that the kid can access this bigger thing called general education curriculum. So we also know that there's no single system that exists. It's not special ed alone. It's not general ed. It's not the SEA or the LEA or the school. That we are all sort of in this together. And I think as we dove a little bit deeper into the commentary, started working with our local educators, we started to recognize there is this isolation within our field that's perpetuating the results that we're getting. And this is concerning because when we look at the data, about 68% of students with disabilities spend 80% or more of their time in general education. So if that's the case, we should at least be seeing about 68% of students benefiting from that general education curriculum that's showing up on our indicators of school success. And about 95% spend some portion of their day within the school experience. And so one of the things is making clear, and I know we were in the Pacific a couple of weeks ago, is that this is a collective, that a student who has a disability doesn't define who their teacher is or where they get those services, but in a sense, they are a student within that school who is also eligible or entitled to these other services to be able to get similar benefit from that school experience. And as a result, the center changed its language to ensure that students are getting access to high quality educational programming. Not a single program, not just special ed, not just IEP, but the entire school experience is part of what they're getting through their day-to-day work at the school. And we define that as a sustainable ecosystem. So if you're not familiar, every national center has a logic model. This is at the far end of our logic model. And our goal is to really identify those essential components of what would be a sustainable ecosystem. And you'll see that with capacity to develop and implement high quality educational programming for all students, not just students with disabilities. And I'm going to share what we have since found so far in terms of those elements that really set teachers up for success in meeting those more rigorous expectations that are sort of highlighted by Andrew, but are also coming out from our other data, like our NAEP data. Now, how many of you are familiar with teacher collective efficacy? Yeah, it's really like the coolest thing since sliced bread. And it's super simple. Well, it's not simple, but it's really cheap and it's free. And so what's super neat about it is being so free, it has a very large effect size. When we look at Hattie's work, he talks about a 0.4 as really sort of producing the equivalent of a year's worth of growth. But when we see this teacher collective efficacy within a school, what we often see are very large effects, those that are beating the odds in a sense. Now, from a simplicity standpoint on paper, it looks really easy. And so if you look at that first part, is that collective belief that you can make a difference. And how many of you came into education, you're like, I'm going to do this. This is the greatest thing. I'm going to make a huge difference. How many of you, like me, were crying after the second month, right? Because you're just like, I can't do this. This is too hard, right? When we lose that belief, we often see a decline in our overall performance. Now, what's interesting is that collective belief, if we go back to that previous slide, it's all teachers. So if we find that teachers of general education or others that are not part of special education don't have that belief that the student can perform or that they have the capacity to support that student, then what we see are lower expectations. And then we don't see the evidence and it confirms, see, I can't help that kid, you need to take him out of our class. And we saw this, this persistent way of looking at how we provide supports to students across the sites that we visited. So when we think about what's the most important thing that sort of came out of Andrew, and if you look at the school itself, it had to do with expectations. Because if those expectations were low and I didn't believe I could support that kid, then the way that we designed the services and ultimately provided those led to lower expectations. So that's where we came back and said, we can't just deal with the IEP. We've got to step back and look at this teacher collective efficacy, this idea of a culture of high expectations for students. Now I'm going to share this video and hopefully it works. Some of you might know Billy. He's actually out of North Carolina. I think he works at the PTI. I think there are 2 of them in the state, but I'll let him tell his story. And his story is really powerful because he really clarifies this need for high expectations, particularly among general education teachers, because the data is really consistent that the disability label, even when kids have similar behaviors, the disability label will ultimately lower the expectation, not just for the special ed teacher, the general ed teacher, but also for the parent, which can then lead lower expectations for the student, right? And Billy will kind of talk about this. So I will say that we actually have a series of videos like this that come from who are now adults, individuals with disabilities, sort of giving their perspective around what's necessary for us to move beyond where we are This is our most popular, so you can download it, and there are some guides that go along with it. So if you are working in a school, for example, or with a family in which there seem to be persistent low expectations, these resources come along with the facilitator guides. They're short videos, so you can use them however you want, but they are available. The one thing I just want to point out is, when we think about this expectations, you'll see that that individual teacher had the belief that he could make a difference and that he would be able to see that difference. Now, what we find is just when one individual does that, any effect from that individual is often lost after about 3 years. So this is where we look at this collective effect, meaning we're looking for that tipping point in which the majority of classroom teachers have those high expectations for all of the students that they work with. So I want to just give you a little bit of time to chat with your neighbors, and it'll probably just be about 3 minutes, but think about what you see in your sites, depending on your role. Do you see this consistent high expectations for students with disabilities? And even if you don't, what can we do to really promote those consistently high expectations? It is the number one thing that will determine whether a student ends up with an IEP that's reasonably calculated to achieve appropriately ambitious. Now, ambitious is not in the decision, but it is consistently written within the decision or the commentary itself. And it is the way that OSEP is thinking about this, because appropriate is often really vague. And they want to make sure that what we're promoting is appropriately ambitious for that student in light of the child's circumstances. So I'll just give you about 3 minutes, and then I'll ask maybe 1 or 2 of you to share out. If you don't like your neighbors, you can talk to somebody else. It's okay. All right, you have about 30 seconds. Okay, so I want to pull you back. If you can hear me, give me a woo woo. If you can see me, give me a wave. Hey guys, yeah. All right, so I did receive a question and I clearly cannot show it to you right now, and I apologize for that. But if you, I will put it back on my slides, and maybe my tech people can help me for some reason. But if you go to the promotingprogress.org website, it'll, the title is over by educators. It's the fourth tab over. The pull down menu says stories from the classroom. So somebody asked me where to find those. That's where you will see a collection of videos. I'd also mention, you know, we are a federally funded center. So if you're doing a presentation, please feel free to use those in there. If you are traveling somewhere in which you're not able, for example, to access the internet, please connect with us and we can help you get an embedded file to be able to share those videos. So you'll see some of them are around belonging, assistive technology, pretty much the whole gamut of things that have happened or that we have found. A lot of those also come through our first 2 years. We did parent and student focus groups in collaboration with the National Center on Learning Disabilities and one of the parent centers to really sort of understand the family context. And that's what also led to some. So does anybody want to share anything that came out of your group? Just because you'll be on live TV? Yes. No, obviously. So I'm going to pass this video or this back.
So we talked about experiences with those kind of outstanding teachers that had high expectations for students and really made a huge difference. And but when they went to the next grade, there wasn't the same expectation and how things began to fall apart. We also talked about the importance of teacher education programs, you know, really empowering teachers to have high expectations for students with disabilities and to collaborate to make that happen. We also talked about, you know, students who are in those programs that do that and then going to do student teaching in schools where that is not the case and being very troubled and challenged by a different level of expectation that their teaching program, you know, had them bring to the classroom.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's actually, I think it's a persistent issue. There are 2 national centers right now, and you're probably very familiar, the IRIS Center, which was meant to sort of provide some of the content for consistency, but also the CEDAR Center. And the CEDAR Center trying to really build, you know, working with those institutions to get some of that. I think particularly the student teaching environment, as you mentioned, is that we come in super excited and then we get into our student teaching, we realize it's not like we imagined. And then we sort of step back. And sadly, some of the lowest expectations that we find among students with disabilities are with special ed teachers. So, and sometimes what we often assume it's general ed teachers. Sometimes general ed teachers have really high expectations that are not realistic, maybe given the child's disability, but they generally have higher expectations for performance than special ed teachers. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
So I'm actually a parent of a child with significant support needs. And it's really the culture of his school. And I think that it's been kind of just built into their culture. Their motto is honoring all learners. So right there, it's already, you know, built in. And then one experience that I didn't think about until you were talking about student teachers was that my son is included 70%, not quite at 80, but we're pretty close. And he had a student teacher in first grade. And she said that having him in there like completely changed her philosophy. And he's super lovable, like everybody's favorite. She's like, he made me a better person, he made me a better teacher, and now I really believe that like he can do anything, and that other students can too. So just that like that experience for her coming from inclusion, and being in the classroom, she like learned a lot from that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think we have research that shows that as well. We have greater empathy. We have general ed teachers who say it really forced me to clarify the outcome of my the unit that I'm doing, and be very thoughtful about the design of the instruction when students with disabilities were included and they were able to collaborate with a special ed teacher. Anything else before? All right, we'll keep it coming. So I will say that, you know, through this work, working with parents, we actually just completed our educator focus groups as well. So we tried to get the full gamut of perspectives. What we found is this idea of collective efficacy, getting us started for an individual student as well as a system, is focusing on the right questions. When we go into schools that are focusing on the wrong questions, that are things like, how do we address the injury decision? How do we get this IEP done? What program does this kid need? Those are questions that often produce responses that, while they might seem relevant, don't really get to the bigger issue. And so we're trying to really focus our conversations, our teaming, the way that we interact with parents or go into a pre-referral meeting, whatever it might be, by first asking, what do we want, right? What do we want for the student? And I think about, as a parent, when I went in, the first thing that somebody said to me is, your kid is struggling in this class. And I said, I pretty much know that because I see all the stuff that comes home every day. And they were trying to tell me all the things they were going to do. And they never once asked me, what do I want, right? What does my kid need? My kid came from a very traumatic background. The way that, you know, they didn't know much about him. He had experienced a lot of childhood trauma in the foster system. And had they known that, then they would have understood that what I wanted for my kid was to make sure he had friends, that he loved school, that he felt safe. I wasn't as worried about reading at the moment because, well, heck, I hope I can teach him reading. We'll see. But there were things that I wanted that obviously he also needed that weren't being addressed, which were leading to some of these issues. So when we turned the conversation around and I said, let's talk about, what do we want? What do you want for my child? And what do I want? You know, I want him to be a healthy, happy adult. I want him to, you know, we had a lot of home issues. Like, I just want generally for this to be a positive experience. And it stopped the teacher because she had told me what she wanted was actually, and this is much later, was to be removed from the class. That's how she came into the conversation. And when we stopped and she understood the circumstances, and I said, what do you want? And she's like, I want him to have appropriate, respectful behavior. Then I say, okay, well, what's the current reality? Well, he does these things, right? And we say, okay, well, what does he need then to be successful? And it helped us rethink the way the IEP was written, the way the services were provided. Because once we had that difference clear, this is what we want, this is where he's at, this is what he needs to move from here to here, then we can start to talk about what we do, right? In some cases, maybe he did need a different environment, or maybe he did need a different teacher or something else. But that wasn't the outcome of interest. It was, how do we get this student to the outcome that we're looking for? And I think about every IEP that we've gone into, we often start here. What is the current reality? Because the IEP's first section, right, is the present levels or the class, right? And we never step back until maybe the kid's in transition age and say, what do you want? And as a result, we start to talk about present levels that may not be relevant to where this kid wants to be in the future. Very simple sort of questions, but it reorients and focuses on what we want in the long term, or the big picture for this student. And I know Valerie, the OSEP director, is very interested in this. She also has a child with a disability. Is that we're not just looking at what's happening right now and how do we address it right now, but we're looking at the future and saying, how do we then leverage school to be able to prepare each child to be successful post-school? Ma'am, hold on a second.
I just want to make the comment that, currently with our IP in Louisiana, it has a section that says parental concerns, and it's always addressed, what is your concern? And if it was readdressed as, what is it you want? It would make so much more sense, and it would be so much more productive conversation, because parental concerns turns into a, complaining session about everything you're doing wrong at school, my child's not learning. So I could see that being a huge changing with the way people work together.
Yeah, and it's such a simple way, to make this change and demonstrate this bigger picture. And I know there was a lot of work in the 90s and early 2000s around big picture planning or futures planning. A lot of it were for students who had more intensive needs. But in general, if we started the conversation as what do we want for this child, then it helps us prioritize the IEP goals. It helps us understand the child's circumstances and impacting them and getting there, so that we're proposing services that are addressing those particular needs.
Ours is called parental input, and we get a form that has all these different categories, and one of them says, what are your hopes and dreams for your child? And I think that really gives you the opportunity to put those really big expectations, and she divides it into like for this year and then for this life. So we could put both of those, and I really like that, because we can dream as big as we want, and then think about goals to get to those things.
Yeah, and I think about the technology now. I mean, heck, we have no idea where it's going to be when the kid graduates in 10 years. And so we have to have those big dreams for students. And then we then start to be more innovative in the way that we support individual students. So if you look at the website itself, which is promotingprogress.org, you will see that the first two tabs are really around development and implementation. And the intent was to create resources to support educators that were easily accessible and were simplistic. And so we got a lot of feedback from our parents and our families, as well as local educators, about what they needed. And so I'll share what some of those look like. But you will notice too that it says high quality educational programming. And we intentionally did not use IEP, as I mentioned before, is because I'm not just trying to create an IEP. If we keep the focus just on the IEP, then we will get a lot of procedurally compliant IEPs. But what we're not getting something that is the development of a program that's within the context of the general school system. And I'll share a visual related to a bike that might help sort of make sense for the educators that you work with. The other thing, and those, I don't know how many lawyers are in here, but I'm sure you've seen some of the emerging case law around implementation, right? We've often talked about the procedural and the substantive requirements for FAPE, but we're definitely seeing more of that that implementation piece. And we want to make sure that it's not that we're just designing something that's reasonably calculated, that we actually implement something to confirm through our progress monitoring data that it was reasonably calculated to help the student, meet those goals that we set. And then what we see is that improved access and outcomes. Now, the way that we have been articulating our work, and this is where you see that INDRU fits in. If we were to only be focusing on INDRU, then what would happen is we would, in a sense, stop with this development of the IEP, and we would never get to this piece here. The effect, right, the actual benefit is this piece, right? But it is built on the assumption that we have an IEP that's procedurally compliant, meaning it has the primary components. There are 7 of those. Your state may have extended that for whatever reason. And that hasn't really changed, those components. Obviously, we haven't reauthorized in a really long time either, but they're not likely to change. I think it's this substantive requirement, the so what, is really where we're starting to see the focus. I know we're working with state departments through the National Center on Systemic Improvement with general supervision, trying to pull away from just the procedural compliance. The trick that the challenge we're having is people don't know how to measure this, right? And as a result, they don't know how to then determine whether something is reasonably calculated. And we have been working with local educators, and I'll share some things that we found that can help with that sort of reasonable calculation. And then the implementation is, I'll give you a little more about that. So how many of you ride a bike? Yeah, how many of you know what a bike is? Okay, well, at least we're there. So if you think about a bike, you know, there are main parts of the bike, right? It's got a wheels and a handlebar and, you know, the seat. And we often think about the procedural requirements of IDEA like this, where each of the 7 parts that are there, each of those 7 parts is critical to this. We have done a lot of professional learning for local educators on each part. And I will say the biggest request that we have received in the last 2 years is, can you tell me what specially designed instruction is? But it assumes, right, that it's something that can be done independently. And in reality, from a substantive standpoint, all of those parts really need to fit together to be anything, right? To allow sort of forward movement or progress. And so if we think about this pieces piece, we do have tip sheets to help people understand each of those pieces, but ultimately focusing solely on developing measurable goals, developing a monitoring plan, helping people understand how to do accommodations is not leading to the results that we want. It's because we're asking the wrong questions. How do we make these IEP goals more compliant? How do we make them look better? And so what we found is that unless that we're developing, we think about this as a substantive requirement, that the present levels are driving everything else, right? We won't know if it's reasonably calculated. We won't know if it's appropriate progress unless the present levels actually indicate this is the kid's needs for supplementary aids and services, or SDI. Or these are the goals that the student needs that would be appropriate progress given the child's circumstances. And I know this is really challenging because it's very rare that people actually evaluate the PLAF. When we look at a procedurally compliant IEP, we often look at the goals and we look at the services that are proposed. And ultimately, it is their connection to the PLAF that determines whether it was reasonably calculated. And we're seeing that more in the case law, is this reference to that present levels to say, well, I didn't see the goals, so I don't know if this is appropriate progress. I don't see any justification for those services, so I don't know if you put them in place, would it be reasonably calculated? Because there isn't really any rationale for why you would do what you said you were going to do. And so this actually came out of in the 90s, but it hasn't been pooled, so it's still relevant. But that this guidance around this direct relationship among the present levels and the other components, that has not changed. And I think the idea about Andrew F. is it just reinforced this particular statement. And the way that we've been talking about it in terms of the Andrew F. is if you are proposing services, and if we look at actually what produces the effect for a student, it's the stuff that we do, right? The SDI, the delivery of our supplementary aids and services, our testing accommodations, those are the things that produce the measurable effects. Ultimately, and that's that reasonably calculated, we don't know if it's reasonably calculated unless the present levels have sort of, in a sense, justified the needs that then ultimately are addressed by this. So one of the things that we're finding that's really helping educators conceptualize this connection is that we ask them to highlight the primary needs or the needs within the PLAF, and then to be able to highlight the associated proposed aids and services. For one, it allows them, hold on one second. It allows them to be able to demonstrate that they have proposed aids and services that address those needs. Hold on one second.
So to your point, in a matrix that I use for dispute resolution IEPs particularly is, but I love the what do you want
piece that's going to go in front of the PLAF, is between the PLAF and the goals, we actually articulate broad needs and then decide what are the goals and accommodations, because some needs can be addressed via accommodations, others require specially designed instruction. And when we get consensus on the needs, then it's very difficult for anybody to backpedal and say, well, no, he doesn't, we don't have to do that service. So, and then by the time you get to the who, the where, the how long, the justification, you talk about the percentage of time in gen ed. If the student needs enabling skills that have to be done through special design instruction, then the implicit process of the IEP is that you build in the hierarchical of transfer and generalization so that you get to that gen ed, as opposed to pulling them out and remaining them out for 400 minutes a week indefinitely.
Yeah, and I think something you're highlighting is the part that we're seeing missing from the present levels is that we're not using it as justification, like you're saying, for the proposed aids and services. They're in a sense just putting numbers and saying, look, this is the present levels. But what you just said, I think is a prime example of IEPs that we see produce results is when I say, in order for this student, or the student is in the general classroom this amount of time, our evidence indicates in order to be successfully involved in, they benefit from this in the present levels. So that when we propose it, right, in our statement of aids and services, then it makes sense. And you're less likely to see this, well, I want this and I want this, because people now see the present levels of justifying what we're proposing. The other thing that we're finding is that when the present levels are completed at the IEP meeting, you're pretty much at a bust, right? Because people are coming in with different perceived levels of what they want and that what is the current reality. And when we have a completed present levels 2 weeks prior to, those go to the gen ed teacher, the parent, the student, you know, whoever, then we have this understanding of the current reality, which then allows us to prioritize the goals that this student needs, right? Otherwise, I mean, we're still finding IEPs that have 22 goals on it. For one, I don't even know how you would monitor that, right? Nor is it like what it's doing is giving equal weight to 22 needs. And that's not likely what's going to happen. So those present levels ultimately determine the primary needs that would be in our progress or our goals. The annual goals, right? Those are things that can change, right? And if they're written appropriately, you know, we can get into the condition, the behavior, and the level of proficiency, but ultimately, if they're written appropriately, then the SDI that we proposed here will ultimately lead to the change on the IEP goal. That's that internal consistency. This is the conceptualization of the IEP that a lot of educators are missing, right? They just see it as moving through the actual document itself, but never coming back. Because any SDI I propose should be directly related to an annual goal. And any annual goal I propose should have associated SDI, right? Because supplementary aids and services are about access, right? Or to make sure the kid can benefit from general curriculum. That benefit is shown on your state assessments or district assessments right here, right? But the SDI is specifically to address those skill deficits that are necessary to be involved in and benefit from the general curriculum. And ultimately, the piece that I think we focus a lot on is that monitoring of progress, right? It's the thing that pops up and it says, well, did the kid make progress? If we assume that what we proposed was reasonably calculated and we put it in place with a high degree of fidelity, then we would see progress on those annual goals as measured by our monitoring plan that we produced. But ultimately, that monitoring plan is also an evaluation of our services. Were they actually reasonably calculated, right? And that's where we might say, gosh, it's not producing the results that I expect. We may need to amend the IEP. And it's that rethinking or, you know, reconceptualizing this IEP. The document hasn't really changed that much. is what's helping educators sort of understand the so what, right? That we don't get people that come to us and say, well, which accommodations do you need for kids with autism? Right. And I'm like, well, I don't really know your kid, right? Because it's the present levels that ultimately describe the needs that the kid has that then should be, justify why they're here. Yeah. Hold on 1 second. I'm getting exercise today.
Just an anecdotal comment as a facilitator and mediator. I appreciate your point because so often both district and parent ignore present level and goal because the hot issue is, does my kid get a one-to-one aid? How much inclusion? My kid needs speech. And I find that during the resolution processes, the team ends up having to go back because they haven't taken enough time on really giving a lot of brain sweat into the present level or the goal, and everything else hinges on it.
And I think sort of to me, the biggest thing that Andrew did is it put the flap back in the limelight, right? Like it made him cool again. Because he wasn't really that cool. For one, he had this weird name called a plap. I mean, who came up with that, right? But the idea is that, yeah, if we anticipate a request from a parent, right? If we send all these present levels 2 weeks ahead of time and they're like, oh, I get it. I get the big picture. I understand what you want. You want your kid to live independently post school. It opens up a more realistic dialogue about, gosh, I know you want your kid to be able to live independently. These are some of the effects if we have a full-time aid and some of the negative consequences. And our data don't really support the need for a full-time. And I think that's where we get so much of our leveraging power and also allows us to meet this requirement of, for one, we know what we're proposing is reasonably calculated. I think the other piece here is this child circumstances, right? That it's not, you're not like every kid with autism. You're not like every kid with a learning disability. This kid is unique. That's the neat thing about IDEA. And as a result of that uniqueness that I've defined in the present levels, I now know what I'm proposing to be appropriate for that particular student. And I think those of you who are doing, we've been talking around like compensatory education. If you don't have that present levels, you're kind of at a loss because you don't know what would have been reasonably calculated. Because as an external person, you have no idea of the particular context of the student. But I want to.
The importance of the present levels is also, I think, the crux at diffusing potential disputes, because if you can get that home and the parents can take a track changes piece or add some comments, then you're bringing in meaningful participation. You're also getting away from, well, they were at the 12th percentile on this test and that test, and you're actually describing the child in a much more pragmatic way. And you're accounting for the fact that at home, the student looks like this, but in the school, the student looks like that. And now part of the goals is how to replicate conditions to support the same kind of consistency across settings, or which would never have come across if teachers or special educators were the only ones constructing the plan. And so it's become the real critical foundation.
And I will say too, I mean, I'm a former special ed teacher, and, we used to send home, for example, the draft IEP. And I guarantee the parents never read the present levels, right? They went straight to the goals and the proposed services. So they don't understand the rationale for those. And I think that's where we start to rethink this idea of, for one, clarifying the child's circumstances. Where do you want them to be? What is that current reality? What does the student need? Those are the first three main questions. We have that conversation. To be honest, the rest should fall into place, right? Because the prioritizing of those needs, with the IEP team should have been clarified, as opposed to saying, I want this and I want that. I should have stayed back there. I apologize.
So I'm a parent and I work at a parent center. And we always train parents to definitely look at the plan, okay? And we also would have, people have developed tools like the positive student profile, the positive self profile. We work with our Department of Education in New Jersey to do that. I think that two things that that also inform this conversation are the need under IDEA to provide services that have some basis in evidence that they might actually be effective, which I think is also often missing. And I think the other thing that often is a barrier to parents being able to be effective participants and develop IEPs and get services for their children that really make a positive impact is that we always train, parent centers always train parents that the components of the IEP are there because they work together to result in positive outcomes for your child. And what many parents unfortunately find when they go to the IEP meeting is that's not the same perspective that the educators have about what the IEP means. And I think that, parents often report to us that they feel like they hit a brick wall because they're coming, because they do see, we talk in training about how all these pieces fit together, and you've got to, start with the present levels as well as your hopes and dreams and your vision for your child and your hopes and dreams for themselves. But I don't think it's parents that come to the table thinking that this is just like a rote thing of sticking in some, words in the boxes but often, unfortunately, I think they get that experience when they meet with educators.
And I would say that we found the very same thing in our focus groups, that it's really the parents came in not even worried so much about the pieces of it, but to really this sort of bigger conversation about how do we support my child. And what we're finding is that educators, particularly those who work in states that have a online template, are often feeling the pressure, whether they agree with it or not, is to just go through the motions. And I think that's something we really need to, as a field, is to step back and say, is that just a reporting document? Or as it's unfortunately being used in many places, is guiding the meeting, right? And that's where then if you use that online version, you can't even go back and look at the present levels because you already moved to the next section. So I would say, and this is that collective efficacy. We talk about the teachers as part of that, but ultimately it's the system, right? If you have one that's really pushing, then it's often perceived as a negative push because they're doing something different, when in reality, we're just not on the same path. And we need to step back and figure out how to get back on that same path. Thank you so much for sharing that. I shouldn't have to say this, but I always get asked to put it in here. It's that just remembering, those present levels, despite this concept, and I think this comes back to exactly what you were saying, is sometimes we're seeing present levels that look consistent. And while it might be possible to have similar looking goals and similar looking services, the present levels should never, ever look similar, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense for that to be the case. Even if two twins have the same disability, there will be the unique circumstances of that child that should be outlined within that present level. So, assuming that we all have the same essential ingredients, we understand that each IEP is going to be uniquely different to match the unique circumstances of that child. And so I just want to share, it doesn't really matter if we stop at the IEP. I think it's what gets the most play, for example, in a due process hearing or whatnot. It really is, if you think about an IEP, has zero effect size, right? The document itself does not produce the effect. What ultimately produces the effect or the change on those IEP goals is the extent to which it's actually implemented. And I think where we're also seeing is this challenge is people are throwing everything into an IEP because people requested or last minute adds that don't really allow for fidelity of implementation. It cannot be feasibly implemented within the context in which it's there, meaning it was not reasonably calculated to produce results. And there are two things that we're finding that are sort of coming out of the case law, and Perry Zerkel has an article about what he refers to as the 4 faces of faith. But we're seeing the same thing, and it's this idea of, can we actually implement the evidence-based practices to produce the results, right? So maybe we've identified them in the IEP, but our teachers are not trained to be able to do that, or the infrastructure doesn't allow it. Special ed teachers are the most interrupted teachers in a single school, right? And where we're less likely to have, we're more likely to have uninterrupted literacy time. We're less likely to have uninterrupted specially designed instruction, right? Because we send kids down or we call or whatever it might be. So one of the things that we're finding, is that the IEP has its role in helping us design and implement high quality educational programming. And that's this little bike right here next to you. But it really is that if that bike cannot be put on a path that's likely to produce results, it doesn't really matter. And this is the contextual piece that we see. I know you had mentioned about your son in terms of this feeling part of the community, this belonging piece. I cannot underestimate the impact. It actually started through the Ties Center and is now a bigger piece. It's going beyond inclusion, because what we found with inclusion is people were physically present. The curriculum maybe was designed for that, but the kid did not feel part of it. And I, as a parent of a child with very severe behavioral mental health, he was a gifted student who got straight zeros, right? So no matter how great the instruction was, he did not feel like he was part of that community. And as a result, there was no benefit from the IEP that was put in place. And we do know that students with disabilities, particularly adults, have higher rates of depression, isolation, and loneliness. So when we think about this concept, we can't just be focusing on high quality instruction. It's high quality instruction within an environment in which the kid feels like they're part of that learning environment. And that requires, and you'll see today I'm just talking about educator support, but it assumes that those educators are supported in a way to promote belonging of all students, right? And also to provide instruction that's based on evidence, that the supplementary aids and services, the way we use the para, the way we train the teachers or provide services for parents is based on evidence, is ultimately here. And this idea of family engagement, this came from our focus groups, both parents, students, and teachers, is that family engagement is a critical piece of this. And if we don't have meaningful family engagement, either in the development of the PLAF or sort of the long-term monitoring of the implementation of the IEP, then we're not likely to get the student where they need to be. And then this ongoing teaming should not be surprising, partly because it's required by law, but also because this idea that there is no single individual or program who can do everything, right? That special education success is ultimately dependent on the quality of what's happening in general ed, right? Because this student is part of the school community. So for those of you, we do get questions around the MTSS. Originally, our scope of work had, how do you include SDI within the MTSS framework? And to be honest, they said, whoa, that's not our charge. Because to be honest, IDEA requires SDI regardless of if you're doing MTSS or not. So it's what they did not want to happen is what happened with the RTI Center, where everyone sort of stopped doing some stuff and said, oh my heck, we're supposed to do MTSS. And we want to make sure that it's clear that students with disabilities are getting those services, whether or not the school is implementing a tiered system of support. But if they are implementing a tiered system of support, specially designed instruction can be delivered as appropriate across any of those tiers of support. And I can share more about that. So before I share some resources and close this up, I just want to say these are the things that we found that sort of set the stage for ultimate success of implementing to be able to produce those gains. And the first one I mentioned is not surprising, is those high expectations, that we have a collective high expectations, not just the parent or not just the special ed teacher,
but this collective understanding. And that comes from school and district administration, state level administration. We can't just be passive in our support of expectations. We have to be proactive and loud about it so as to get that sort of tipping point that all folks believe that students with disabilities can succeed. Number two, you'll see is that we need to articulate what we want kids to be able to do and ultimately why we want them to be able to do that. This is the thing we're finding in the IEPs is it's not really clear what's the intent of all of the services that we're providing. So the present levels need to really clear what are the things that this student needs to be able to do to access and benefit from the general curriculum. Knowing the circumstances, this is the other thing that when we invested with schools, and we actually got a lot of pushback, when we invested with schools though in developing a robust PLAF, everything else seemed to fall into place. So we just have to be careful about jumping too quickly to things like how to write the goal or how to design the services, because those don't make sense if you don't have the associated present levels to justify their existence. And then what we can say, yes, ma'am, hold on one second, because I have to do that.
Just one other thing that I think is really important is that too often parents report to us that the PLAP is only what the kid can't do and not what the student knows and can do that can be built upon in order to be able to achieve the goal. So I think that's a really critical component, that it really needs to be a comprehensive present levels of performance.
I really appreciate that, because the thing we're also trying to educate folks on is those strengths can actually be leveraged, right? To be able to do these skills that we want them to do. But if we're not writing, I think about the PLAF. If you look at it, the regs say it's a statement, one statement. Now, some of you probably have present levels where you have a paragraph here and a paragraph here and a paragraph here. Those often promote sort of siloed scopes of work or proposed work. And in reality, the PLAF is like a story, right? It's illustrating this kid, the whole child, and how they sort of interact with this school. And that they have a disability. That's how they ended up getting this document in the first place. But how does that disability impact their day-to-day, both from a positive and a negative? And you probably already know that the regs, when they were reauthorized, really clarified academic achievement and functional performance. And that's something I'm not talking about today, but it is something that we have found is underrepresented in the present levels, as well as in the IEP goals. And most students with disabilities struggle to access and benefit from general curriculum because of functional skill needs that result from the disability. So ultimately, we should probably see a lot more functional goals as a result. And that's where we think about, what does this kid need, right, to benefit from reading? Do they just need to be able to read faster, or do they need some metacognitive or cognitive strategies, right? Some functional skills, executive functioning needs to be able to benefit from your instruction around reading fluency that ultimately leads to better benefits in reading. So these are the things that we're finding, in terms of these, where we even start, right? Because if we don't address these things, then putting the IEP becomes more of this fill in the boxes, and some of the stuff you see just literally doesn't make sense. As a parent, as a gen ed teacher, and I know we're in the Pacific, and gen ed teacher says, it doesn't make sense to me. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do, right? And if it doesn't make sense to the team, then it's not likely to be complete. So I'm just going to use my last time just to share some resources that we have available. If there's something you don't see and you're interested in, let us know. We work collaboratively, as I mentioned, with a couple of PTIs to create resources. I'll share one up here that we will be releasing this week. But we also work with other national centers to release tools. And I will say that our tools, we actually got a lot of pushback initially around getting back to basics. I can't explain how much negative pushback we got around our tip sheets, for example, because the assumption was people knew that stuff. They needed to know how to teach, right? And what we found from ours was like, no, people don't know what they're supposed to teach because they're lacking these basics. So even though you might get pushback from your educators, like I know that even that sort of refreshing or rethinking about the present levels has been really powerful in terms of, refining the work that they're doing. We're trying to make this process more simplistic, right? So that we can really get to the meat of it, which is our relationships with families and students, and ultimately the delivery of the services. So, and I will say this, providing support, don't assume that educators know, particularly new educators. I think we heard that. I think if you're an administrator and you're sitting in a meeting, don't make assumptions. I think there's a great quote that's right here out on the wall. If you're not so sure, make sure you ask. And I think a lot of new teachers coming out of programs feel a lot of pressure to know everything. And so they say nothing. And that ultimately leads to this trickle down where you got on the dirt road and you should have been on the nice clear paved road. I mentioned the tip sheets. So we have a number of tip sheets. We have one for each critical criteria of the 7. And then one of the things by request actually came is the overview of aids and services, which is the 4th part of the IEP, is really meaty. And to be honest, like you were saying, it's the one that has the evidence-based practices, produces the effects. So we actually broke that one down further into 4 tip sheets. We have simply used these, meaning we don't have a lot of PowerPoint, and I know some of the folks I mentioned have done this, is that we take, for example, this overview of aids and services, and we take it to a training and we just give the team time to read it. What we have found is about 80% on average have never read that statement from IDEA. And I'm not talking about local educators, I'm talking about state level educators as well. Right? Because there's an assumption or this assume-aside that people know, so they never take the time to come back, right? And that reorientation to the language can be really empowering and really enlightening. The same thing when, people always say, well, I don't know if it's an accommodation or is that SDI? Doing that with these handouts creates that level of clarity, so that when we go to an IEP meeting, we can say, gosh, and we see this with high school IEPs, it looks like we proposed a lot of accommodations and modifications, but I don't see the SDI in here. I don't see what we're teaching this student to be able to be more successful. That way we don't sort of make assumptions that it's there. And I'll share this. We also have this other packet. This is under the instructional briefs. These are focused on 6 high leverage practices that have a significant evidence base for kids with disabilities across disability category and grade span. And there are things like explicit instruction, systematic instruction, intensifying instruction, and then metacognitive and cognitive strategy instruction, as well as teaching social behaviors. So you can see those. Now I'm going to pass this to a friend.
You. My name's Joy. I'm a director of a parent center, and I really appreciate you emphasizing the getting back to basics, because for many parents, it's kind of a no-win situation, right? Like if we're going into an IEP meeting and we don't know what our rights are and we can't advocate, then there's really no shot, right? It's very challenging for the parent to secure what they need for their child. But there's also many situations when parents do know, we're asking the right question, and that feels threatening to educators. So either way, it's an uphill battle to build those relationships, whether we know what we're doing or we don't know what we're doing. So I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah. And I think this idea of just building the capacity of one group like parents without building the capacity of others is just going to leave us in the same situation.
I agree 100%. I'm with the Parent Center in Louisiana. We actually, I personally have actually started bringing y'all's tip sheets to IEP meetings, and one of 2 things typically happen, and you can figure it out real fast. If the special ed teacher or anybody on that team really is informed of the basics and what they should know, they love it and they say, this is great, this will give me what I need to be able to do the right thing. If nobody at that team knows anything and knows the basics, it's kind of just push to shove and it's like, well, that's nice to have. But where I've found them very impactful in places where there's at least one team member that understands the basics and understands the importance of really that, knowing what those present level of performances and that how do you have a goal without knowing that and how are you going to measure progress? The other comment I have is that, at some point through this whole process, if a child isn't making progress, we have to decide what we're going to do. And that's still a mystery out there that, because what we want to do is just keep doing the same thing over and over again and not change anything. And that's something that I'd like to see addressed more. At what point do you determine that what you're doing isn't working? And when do you instead of rotate the tires, totally change them on something new?
And actually, we have a center for that. Not the tire changing, of course, but the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And it was for that particular purpose, was to identify a validated approach for intensifying or modifying the program when the student was not progressing as expected. And I think what happened is that center was funded prior to us, was picked up more from the MTSS world, primarily for tier 3. But its initial intent, it was an OSEF funded center, was really, and we specifically stated it, for kids not making progress on their IEP goals. So we have on this, we have a free training materials. We have a 3-part law series that's available. It was developed in collaboration with David Bateman and Perry Zirkel. And then we have a training module that gets back to basics on each of the components. Some of them are still in the queue. And also those evidence-based high leverage practices I mentioned, there's a learning module. We just released our planning one. I just reviewed yesterday the final version for the intensifying. So those will be coming up as well. And then just some other things, when we've been trying to make sure our materials really focus on the why, like you were mentioned, not so much on the what. I mean, on the what, but in the context of the why. This focusing on this coherence piece and then working as a team. And if we feel like we're not working as a team, then that's where we're looking at how do we rebuild that. I feel like the administrators are going to be our key. So like you were just saying, if you bring an IEP tip sheet, the administrator is in the position to be able to say, oh, well, thank you. I'm not in special ed and this is new to me, right? To sort of soften that and say, well, let's read this. Okay, I see what you're seeing. How can we, what is this? So it's not putting the special ed teacher on the spot saying, oh my heck, you don't know that, right? Because nobody wants that, but it's trying to get that information in a way that sort of keeps people on the same page, right? We're not here to say it's your fault or your fault. It's that really we need this collective advocacy to help this particular thing. We have a lot of work that's focusing on high expectations. Our focus groups will be coming out. We do a thought leader summit every year if you're interested in participating. Our focus this year is actually on secondary service delivery. And part of it is it came from our parent, family, and teacher focus groups that secondary was particularly difficult. And that quote I said, we're providing a lot of supplementary aids and services to give them access, but we're kind of pushing them through the system and not really providing that specially designed instruction. Some other things developed in collaboration with our Louisiana Parent Center is just some resources. If you don't have some of those, I know there are some floating around, but like you said, if we are all on the same page, if general ed teachers don't know that parents are coming in with these or aren't sharing with parents ways to come into the meeting better prepared, then it's really us and them. And so these resources, which should be released on Friday, are just they're very low tech ways to get people opportunities to think about the right questions, document some of their thoughts. And like you said, it assumes that they received the present levels in a timely manner. Maybe they didn't, but that might be a question like, hey, it would be really helpful for me if you sent this at this period of time. And then we can engage in a better conversation. We also have something that I'll just promote for next summer is we do what's called a dissemination event. It's not a very fancy name, but it is a national free event in which we share sort of the back to basics, what we found. We had about 500 participants this year. It was all virtual. We'll likely keep it virtual, but something else we do is we provide on-site versions of that. So we were in the Pacific Islands for 2 weeks working with WAM and then also with CNMI. And then we've done the same thing. Have one tentatively scheduled in Louisiana, but in New York City. So we're working there as well as Nevada. So those are often for smaller groups. It depends on how they get marketed, but we are a free technical assistance center. And so what we do is provide what's referred to as field-based initiatives, meaning if you're looking for this, we can come in and provide some of that in a short term with the intent of building local capacity to continue to do that, right? And then I'd share just some activities that we're working with institutions of higher ed as well as state departments, is helping them really build that capacity of local educators. This is an example where we've seen the greatest level of ahas. It's not a very scientific way, but it's really helped teachers understand the importance of the present levels. Because the biggest thing that they often find is they highlight the needs in the present level, they highlight the proposed aids and services, and they often see a lot of services that don't have any indication of why they're there. And what they may find, for example, is, oh, we just put those accommodations in there because it's what we do with all kids with learning disabilities, or somebody asked for it, so I just wrote it down. And that doesn't really lead to an appropriate proposed program. So helping them sort of understand that importance of the PLAF to justify it. Same thing with, like, there are some activities that are similar to goals. They're very simplistic, but it just gets people to dive in. We have some fake ones. So we found sometimes those are easier for people to judge and critique. They're often more defensive, as you might imagine, when they're doing their own. So we have looked at some alternative ways to do that to support educators and improve them. And then our partners, as parents as partners, we do work closely with our PTIs. We're not meant to create new resources. What we're doing is taking existing resources and making them accessible to different audiences, particularly gen ed teachers, so they are aware of what needs to change. PTIs often are working with parents with the assumption, right, that gen ed teachers are getting and special ed teachers are getting the same training. So we're trying to make that accessible to them. There's also a parent module that was developed for educators to understand how to more effectively engage them. And then something else I would just say in terms of 2 tips, we have this resource that's called FAIR. And it's been really helpful to get educators to be realistic about what they can propose. Sometimes they over propose and actually have worse results because they end up putting nothing in place. And so if we have a present levels that prioritizes the needs and the services, then we're more likely to get those. So we look at services that are feasible, acceptable, impactful, and relevant. And so I can share, I think I uploaded it, but I can share it. And then the last thing I'll share before I end is just really around this fidelity. This is coming from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Might be a future presentation if interested, but it does really get at this idea of how do we continue to implement what we proposed in a way that produces results, and then make those adaptations as needed based on the student's response to that SDI that's being provided. So I'll stop right there. I know I'm right at time. And I'll stay around for a little bit, but I just want to thank you all for attending today. I know this is, to me, a very important conference, and I think it's our collective communication, our persistent, consistent communication is what's necessary for us to make these more substantive changes within our system. So enjoy the rest of your day, y'all. Thank you.